If I asked most people what they thought would be currently the worst Warframe in the game, there's going to be, a specific selection of characters that are brought up, and I think that Oberon is one of the most common as of current. And it's unfortunate to say that that's kind of been a theme throughout the lifespan of the game. Oberon has never been at the top of the pack. If I can remember correctly, when he first got his big overhaul rework, he was competing with Trinity a little bit and, people started using him more, but reality is he never really found his own lane in the game. Standing out as the Paladin frame, who is trying to be, sort of a sub-DPS, mostly just healer tank, it's kind of hard to stand out in the broader scheme of the game when we've got frames that are dropping now that just do everything. I personally believe that Oberon is currently completely usable, much like every other frame in the game. I think all of them are usable, which is a really nice state to be in, as opposed to, in the past where Hydroid, for example, at its worst, wasn't even remotely usable because he just couldn't scale. I like using Oberon. I think he's a ton of fun, I think his fashion is really interesting and so is his theme, but unfortunately I think he does require a big buff or maybe even a rework. Today I wanted to quickly talk about his kit, his theme, what can maybe be done, some suggestions for changes, and also get you guys' input in the comments as to what you think could be done to help Oberon keep up with the rest of the Warframe roster and bring him in line. Warframe reworks are actually quite common nowadays and often very good, and I think this will actually probably happen within the next year. Oberon's theme is a bit wishy-washy. He's like a paladin, he's themed around nature, animals, he's a goat in terms of his appearance. His abilities do radiation, he spawns grass on the ground, and his passive has to do with, the nature element and linking with your companion. Speaking of which, let's move on to his passive real quick, which I literally had to just look in the game to remind myself of what it was, because it's just that bad. Giving yourself a free revive for your companion is fine, but really isn't that useful in the grand scheme of things, and then a 25% bonus on your link to health and armor and shields. Like, who cares? It's so minimalistic and doesn't really affect gameplay. I think what they could do with this passive will tie into when I start talking about his other abilities, which we're going to do real quick. And to cover his abilities as a whole and what could be improved upon, we got to look at Frost. Frost has received quite a few changes over time and has gotten significantly stronger. He's really good right now, and to be honest, one of the biggest changes he got was the fact that they just made his primary type of damage better. Frost of course deals cold damage and buffs himself with cold damage as well with his augment, and cold is now extremely strong because it boosts your crit damage on enemies that are frozen, and you can fully freeze enemies with 10 stacks. Meanwhile, we look at someone like Oberon, who has, in my opinion, probably the worst elemental damage type in the game right now. Radiation has been nerfed for whatever reason over the years. It used to once, get rid of ancient healers' Xmas aura, so they wouldn't, give that 90% damage reduction to their allies because, they're fighting each other. Deactivating these auras is something that was just removed. Radiation just causes confusion now, and it's better to kill the enemies than have them fight each other. It's not like Corvex or Nyx where this damage type is made much more use of, especially on Nyx. In Oberon's kit it's just sort of there and almost doesn't even make sense. Sure, the radiation damage does help him take less damage from enemies because they're shooting each other, and of course he's not a complete face tank with Renewal. There are better tanks in the game, so it does help keep him and his allies alive. It doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, it's just not useful by comparison because other damage types are better. His first ability, Smite, is unfortunately single target. It does send out other projectiles and hit other enemies, which I think could be played into a change that I'd like to see, but for the most part all that damage is going on the single targeted opponent, which will then deal huge damage versus their HP, but only if they're armor stripped. Sure, you can spam it, knock an enemy down. This is actually better on some other Warframes when subsumed, and its augment is fine. Being able to boost your damage by a huge percentage, even though it's radiation, it's still useful, but once again it does mean it pales in comparison to other elemental damage buffs, even though you can stack them. It's cool, it's a great augment, makes him way better, and I have no problems with getting a massive 400% radiation damage bonus, but this ability and his kit across the board will just be better if radiation was better. As for this ability, I don't like the fact that its main focus is around being single target. I think any enemy this ricochets between and hits should mark an enemy and debuff them. I'm a huge fan of debuff tools. I think this could behave very similar to Nezha's Halo, where he, slings it and it rebounds between enemies, gives a huge debuff, just something to boost his damage more. I think this would be a very simple buff to make this ability way more useful across the board. Hallowed Ground, his second ability, is actually very cool, and I kind of would like to keep it. I know some people think that this is kind of giving the same vibe that Hydroid's old puddle did, but I think there's something to be made here. At the moment, it's damage and it's tick rate. too low. It does radiation base, which honestly, I feel like this should be doing radiation and toxin. Something about it gives, toxin vibes. It's like vines coming out the ground, turning the environment around him into some sort of, toxic swamp. It's what is conveyed in his prime trailer, but doesn't really feel like that when you're playing. So a simple change would be to increase either the damage or the rate of the ticks and have it do toxin at the same time as radiation. I think that would be very good. And then, combine that with the potential debuff from his 1 and you've got much more damage on your hands. And a nice little base range buff would also be nice for this, because right now I just think it's a bit too short. I do, however, like the ability synergy with Renewal. Speaking of Renewal, I think this ability and its, armor buff synergy with Hallowed Ground is completely fine. I honestly wouldn't change Renewal at all. Maybe you could add bonus synergies, but for the most part, I like how he's not a complete face tank within the game, because that's not really his theme. He could get out tanked by someone like Chroma, but health regen is nice. It's great support for the team overall. It is competing with Wisp in some ways. Maybe give it a range buff. But for the most part, I think Renewal is fine. He doesn't need to be any more tanky. Not every frame needs to have their base kit and playstyle resort in them being able to go, level cap. That's what shield gating's for. I think Renewal's great. However, a synergy I don't like is between his 4th and Hallowed Ground. His 4th Reckoning has a synergy where if you hit enemies with it with a certain amount of power strength that are on Hallowed Ground, you'll strip their armor. Don't get me wrong, I want the armor strip to stay in the game, but this should be doing it without the synergy. Not only is the strength threshold for this to full strip enemies with this combination higher than that of Caliban, but Caliban can strip enemies armor with his 4 easy multiple lingering casts of huge AoE fields that strip armor instantly, but you don't have to combine it with any of his other kit. Meanwhile, Reckoning requires you to often put down Hallowed Ground and even cast your 4th, sometimes twice depending on your strength that you can fit in your build, just to get an armor strip off. In my opinion, Hallowed Ground should just be a very simple armor strip slam. Its damage isn't really that good, and if it was, it would be, too spammy and probably overpowered. Just make this strip armor from base, it'll make it way more efficient on the casting, and then it will do more damage with the synergies of, adding a debuff to the 1 and more damage on the 2. But god, they just need to make that synergy not necessary to strip armor, and also probably lower the strength threshold on the full strip. Moving back to the passive, I think this is where you could lean into more of his nature theme and how he, kind of behaves like the area he's standing in belongs to him. He makes, the ground his swamp and then summons nature to fight with him. I think Oberon should probably have the mod Duplex Bond built into his passive. Just selecting a companion with this Warframe and automatically have them perform Duplex Bond would triple his overall damage output and make him more of the summoner that I feel like he's kind of embracing. Maybe this should only apply to, Kavats and Kubros. Sentinels, it wouldn't really make sense. I'd be cool with that as well. Being able to stack this with actual Duplex Bond and then just having a bunch of your own cats and dogs running around. Maybe even make it more specific and have them summon, some of those wild Kubros that you see on the Earth Tile sets and have them scale based on, the mods you have on your Kubro or your Kavat. Because without a change like that to really lean into his theme, he won't feel too much like what he's supposed to. He's just going to be a health tank that deals damage and, spreads his ground everywhere. But where's that nature theme? We need to lean into it more. So yeah, to recap, Duplex Bond in his passive, maybe summoning 2 extra Kubros for tripling your damage from your companions as a passive, having the multiple projectiles hitting enemies, mark enemies on your 1 and give them huge debuffs to take way more damage, giving the 2 toxin damage, increasing its range and increasing its overall damage tick rate, keeping Renewal the same, and then for his 4th, removing the necessity to combine it with Hallowed Ground in order to receive the armor strip bonus. It should be stripping armor on its own cast and not require a bunch of power strength to achieve that full strip. Lowering this down to something like, Terrify's value for example, will make this way easier to build for. As where Oberon stands right now, I think he is totally usable across the game, very fun. He can buff his teammates damage, spread good CC and damage overall, good self-sustain and sustain for his boys. The problem is his overall damage is easily outclassed and so is his healing, to be honest. Wisp is just way more effective at keeping the teams alive. They're better damage buffs to get from other augments in the game. Smite just doesn't really compete based on the fact that radiation isn't good, and Hallowed Ground kind of feels like an absolute necessity to keep on the kit based on its synergy with the 4, which is annoying because it's arguably one of, if not his weakest abilities in the kit, and then you can't remove it via helmet because you need it to synergize with the 4, makes his kits really restrictive. And yeah, I definitely think a range increase on this and probably this 4 would be huge for him. Right now he kind of just feels very close range. You want to build him a ton of strength and then not really pump him full of range because you know you've got to balance out all of his kit, his augments, and more often than not you don't really have the opportunity to fit in something like stretch. A range increase would go huge. So I'm crossing my fingers that Oberon's actually going to get a rework by the end of this year, because Pablo has been really consistent with trying to make every single Warframe in the game at least competitive with each other across the board, because now they're super consistent and I don't think there's a single bad Warframe in the game. Even someone like Loki, who maybe not be particularly useful on the damage department, he's getting better and better with arcanes that are synergizing with his kit, and his abilities are still really powerful what they do. I think Oberon is extremely easy to make a much better frame, and I'm sure they'll do it within the next year. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave it a like and a sub. All my links are in the description if you're interested. I appreciate all the support on the videos as per usual, and I'll see you guys in the next one.